Hi, let's focus on the actual American Revolution. Before we go into the American Revolution, I do want to preface this with kind of saying this is a survey course, so I'm not going to go into the meat and potatoes and all the battles during this revolution. And in fact, this is just going to be a very broad overview. So I apologize to my war historians that wanted more, but of course you can always take an upper level history course that focuses merely on the American Revolution. But let's go ahead and get started. The American Revolution kind of is one of those things that kind of shocks the world. Like mentioned in the last lecture, how could the Americans ever hope to defeat that mighty British Empire in a military conflict? It seemed hopeless, or if not impossible. In fact, the impossible obstacles uh, that the Americans faced, especially after the guns firing at Lexington and Concord in 1775, without even a continental army. Uh, like I mentioned, few Americans had any organized military experience, no method of training or supplying or even paying an army. Uh, and also the last thing, which has been mentioned before, the majority of Americans opposed the war in 1775, even with the skirmishes in Lexington and Concord and a few others. Many historians only believe about a third of Americans supported the war against the British at this time. Now, those early battles that I mentioned, Lexington and Concord, happened in 1775 and can best be described as British military victories and maybe American moral triumphs. The British routed the Minutemen at Lexington, but the relentless colonists will unleash brutal sniper fire on the British returning to Boston from Concord. So early skirmishes or battles, the military of the British will, of course, win, but they will take heavy losses through the tenacity of the colonists or the militias through sniper fire. And in fact, in June 1775, the colonists will actually fail to win at Bunker Hill, but they inflict a heavy, heavy price by way of casualties on the British military force, which is vastly superior. A year later, in 1776, while the British occupied New York, George Washington led his army to two surprise victories at Trenton and Princeton that will actually uplift the morale of the Patriots. This slide title kind of says it all. George Washington, we all know the Valley Forge story. He lost in Philadelphia and will lead his troops to Valley Forge to spend the winter. None of the world's powers had come to the aid of the Patriot cause yet. Uh, I want to stress that at this time, the world is kind of looking on this revolution, these colonists fighting the empire of Great Britain, and they're not wanting to take a side because, first of all, they don't want to spend the money. Secondly, they're not sure, how this is going to turn out. Everyone. Well, they're not sure, but they have a feeling that, of course, how could the British military lose? But the colonists have sent representatives around the world. In particular, Benjamin Franklin is in France, uh, making the case for the French should support the colonists and independence and help the colonists by way of military supplies, monies, and most importantly, ships. In early 1778, the French actually agreed to recognize American independence and will actually form a permanent alliance with our new nation. The military help and sizable stores of the much needed gunpowder will soon arrive here in the colonies, and the tide starts to turn a bit in favor of the colonists. Now, the American Revolution is a new type of war. It's a new type of war that actually will create a frustration on the part of the British military. First of all, the British will lose at Saratoga, creating a humiliating point in their history. Uh, Now, the British capturing the enemy's capital, Philadelphia, did not give them much of an advantage. So the British having Philadelphia, true, it's demoralizing to the colonists, to the Americans, but not much of an advantage. As long as the American Continental Army and the militias remained in the field, the British would need to keep on fighting. And no matter how much damage the British did to the American cities or private property, the Americans refused to surrender. This actually is a new type of warfare. These Americans will fight from the trees, from the bush. They're not going to be lining up in tactical maneuvers out in the open. It's a new type of warfare. In October of 1781, the war virtually came to an end when General Cornwallis was surrounded and forced to surrender the British position at Yorktown, Virginia. And in fact, 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris made it official. America was independent. Now, I apologize. I know we kind of jumped through so many battles and tactics, uh, but I do want to stress that this new type of warfare, this guerrilla warfare that the American continent, the United States Continental Army, these state militias are using, pretty much frustrate the British, and to a point where they're still fighting a different type of warfare. While the Americans are fighting this guerrilla style warfare from the trees, from the bush, not out in the open. Also, France's ability to aid by way of navy is very, very important, and actually is the impetus for the surrender of General Cornwallis, the British general, creating the way for independence for America. Now, I always like to do comparison, British strengths and American weaknesses during this conflict. The British seemed unbeatable, right? During the previous 100 years, the British had enjoyed triumph after triumph over nations as powerful as France and Spain. At first look, the odds are clearly against the Americans, but a closer look provides insight into how these underdogs, these Americans, became victorious. Britain's military was the best in the world. Their soldiers were well fed, equipped, disciplined, well paid, and they had a British Navy that dominates the seas. They had money. They could raise money a lot faster than the Continental Congress. But some of that funds actually was used to hire mercenaries to help the British, as opposed to the Americans, which really couldn't afford to hire anybody other than themselves. Now, the American strengths, the British had to fight this war far, far away from home. Military orders, troops, and supplies sometimes took months to reach their destinations, to reach the British troops. And the British have an extremely difficult objective. They had to persuade the Americans to give up their claims of independence. So that's a lot harder than it sounds, right? That once the Americas and Americans are on board with independence, pretty much they're fighting for a way of life, as opposed to the British Army far away from home, trying to convince people to give up their dream. As long as the war continues, the colonists' claim continues to gain validity. As long as the colonists are fighting, uh, then they are a nation. The world has to accept them because they're still fighting against the British. Now, also, here in the New World, the geographic vastness of the colonies proves to be a hindrance to the British effort. Despite the British occupying every major city, which I mentioned earlier, the British still remain at a disadvantage because there's just so much land. Uh, there's just, just look at a map of the colonies and then go west. We talked about the Appalachians. It's a vastness of all these colonies. Americans had a grand cause in this, which may have been the greatest advantage. Americans were fighting for their rights, their independence, and their liberty. It wasn't just it wasn't just like the British who were just fighting a war to deny independence, as opposed to fighting for independence. Now, American military and political leaders were inexperienced, but they were surprisingly competent. Uh, the war was expensive, and the British population actually turned against the government, saying, "Why are we being taxed for this war far, far away in the New World where all those savages live?" So the British sentiment for this war, not necessarily all on board. And in Parliament in Britain, there are many American sympathizers regarding this revolution. Lastly, the alliance with the French, which I mentioned earlier, gave the Americans the courage and the tangible threat that would actually tip the scales in favor of the American forces.